Have you ever felt afraid of the void? Not the ordinary kind like a dark room or an empty space, but the true void. The abyss that exists between the stars, where sound, light, and even the very concept of time seem irrelevant. This is my world. My name is Elias Carter, commander of the Nightmare of Void. And what I'm about to tell you is not for the faint of heart. The Nightmare of Void is a ship designed to explore the farthest reaches of the unknown. Our mission is to investigate spatial anomalies, inexplicable phenomena, distorted radio signals, and objects that defy logic and physics. We are the first to make contact with whatever hides out there, and often we are the last. My crew is small but efficient. Marcus, our chief engineer, a man with a sharp wit and an even sharper mind, keeps us running. Clara, the data scientist capable of deciphering terrifying patterns and turning numbers into tangible horrors. Jace, the brilliant navigator whose ability to calculate impossible routes borders on the supernatural. Sarah, in charge of communications, always calm and methodical. Victor, the doctor who tries to keep our sanity intact. And Lena, our extraterrestrial biology expert, the most curious among us. It was supposed to be another ordinary night between Andromeda and the Milky Way. We were monitoring signals, analyzing patterns, and searching for anything out of the ordinary, a repetitive task that, most of the time, brought nothing but exhaustion. But that night something different happened. The alarm blared, a shrill sound that coursed through every corridor of the ship like a mechanical scream. I rushed to the command bridge and found Clara already in front of the main screen, her eyes wide. "Captain, you need to see this," she said, her voice trembling. On the screen, a bright point was rapidly approaching us. It wasn't an asteroid nor a comet, and definitely not anything human. Sarah attempted to send a standard contact message, a protocol designed to facilitate communication with any form of intelligent life. What we received in return wasn't language, but distorted symbols and colors that seemed to vibrate beyond what the human eye should be able to perceive. Something impossible to interpret without feeling a sharp pain in your head. The object stopped, abruptly. A solid thing, motionless in the middle of nowhere as if it were watching us. "This doesn't make sense," muttered Jace, examining the data. "Nothing can just stop like that." Then it began to change. It wasn't an ordinary transformation. It was as if the very reality around it was being bent and twisted. Shapes emerged, writhed and dissolved, like tendrils of darkness reaching out, in all directions. The thing pulsed alive in a way that shouldn't have been possible. And then we saw it. A figure emerged from the distorted forms, something that resembled a man but only had the silhouette of one. It wore filthy rags like a beggar lost between worlds, and its face, what should have been a face, was covered by a grotesque mask, a deformed grin that seemed crafted to mock our very sanity. It laughed, a maddening sound that cut through the vacuum and echoed off the walls of the ship, as if space itself were laughing at us. It tried to order them to shut off the cameras, but no one could move. We were paralyzed, trapped in that living nightmare that made no sense at all. And then, as suddenly as it began, the transmission ceased. The object remained stationary out there, as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. Something inside us. Because even now, as I write this from the illusory safety of my cabin, I can still hear that laughter. And I know it's out there, waiting. The laughter echoed through the ship, an unnatural sound that seemed to emanate from the very walls, saturating the air. Each note of that insane cackle was like a blade slicing through the sanity of the crew, who struggled to maintain their composure in the face of mounting terror. When Sarah reported that the sound was coming from inside the ship, the captain tried to deny it. But deep down, he knew they were dealing with something beyond human comprehension. The monitors flickered, uncontrollably, revealing empty corridors that inexplicably displayed shadows moving on their own. Then on one of the farthest cameras, the masked figure appeared, tilting its head as it stared directly into the lens and pointed at them. Despair grew as the ship seemed to transform into a living nightmare. After ordering the cameras to be shut off, the laughter ceased, leaving behind a silence just as oppressive as the previous noise. But the danger was still present. The sensors couldn't detect anything clearly, as if the space around them had been warped. It was as though reality itself was being manipulated. The captain decided to split the team even though he knew it was risky. He and Marcus headed toward the corridor where the masked figure had last been seen, armed with plasma lasers that felt woefully inadequate against the unknown. When they arrived, the corridor was empty. Bhutan invisible presence loomed over them. When a door opened by itself, revealing absolute darkness, the captain and Marcus advanced cautiously. But when they tried to turn on the lights, nothing happened. Then, a faint glow emerged in the center of the room, revealing distorted geometric patterns and symbols painted in what looked like blood. In the middle, a chilling message. "He is laughing at you." Terrified, Marcus pointed to a mirror leaning against the wall. The captain realized that the reflection showed the masked figure standing behind them, even though the room was empty. Even more horrifying, their own reflections were distorted, displaying expressions of deep fear that didn't match their actual feelings. The laughter returned, this time emanating from the mirror. The sound grew in intensity, reaching unbearable levels as their reflections continued to laugh uncontrollably. Trying to escape, they discovered the door had locked itself. But when the laughter abruptly stopped, the door swung open, and they fled into the corridor. Back in the bridge, the rest of the crew awaited them, visibly shaken. Before they could explain what had happened, a new message appeared on the main monitors. "You cannot escape the void." The message on the screen, "You cannot escape the void," echoed like a sinister warning, carrying with it an oppressive sense of inevitability. The space around the ship seemed to come alive, folding in on itself as Clara struggled to process the impossible data flooding the sensors. Victor loudly denied what his eyes were seeing, but Lena pointed to the external monitor. The mysterious object had moved closer, pulsating with alien colors and mutating geometric patterns. It was hypnotic, almost painful to look at. And then it began to expand. It wasn't just the object growing. The very space around it was being consumed by an absolute darkness. Stars disappeared, swallowed by the void spreading like spilled ink. The crew watched helplessly as the cosmos gradually died. Jay shouted that space itself was imploding, but no one knew what to do. Elias Carter, for the first time since taking command of the nightmare of void, felt utterly lost. Then, the masked figure reappeared, but this time it wasn't confined to cameras or reflections. It was everywhere, on the screens, in the shadows cast by dim lights, even etched into the metal of the walls. Its grotesque smile mocked them, and its presence invaded their minds. A deafening laugh echoed inside their heads, a cacophony of voices, whispering disjointed phrases. "The void has always been here. You were never real. Laugh with me." Elias collapsed to his knees, pressing his hands against his ears. But the sound came from within him, as if it had pierced his soul. Around him, the crew succumbed to panic. Clara laughed hysterically, mimicking the masked figure's laughter, while Lena muttered about wrong shapes. Jay stood frozen, transfixed by the void beyond the windows. Victor screamed that the masked figure was inside them, consuming their minds. Elias tried to calm them, insisting it was psychological, but his words fell on deaf ears. Sarah still maintained some composure, adjusting the communication controls to send an emergency message. Before she could transmit it, the monitors displayed a horrifying image. Earth. But not the Earth they knew. It was a distorted version, covered by a living layer of darkness, with monstrous shapes moving beneath its surface. At its center, hovering like a malevolent shadow, was the masked figure. Clara realized the truth before the others. He's already been there. He's already been everywhere. Elias understood then that this entity wasn't just a threat to them. It was a threat to everything. The laughter echoed again, louder, and more insane than ever, as if the universe itself were laughing at their insignificance. When Marcus asked what to do, Elias had no answer. The masked figure tilted its head, studying them, and pointed directly at Elias. Lena trembled as she whispered, "He wants you. He came for you." Before Elias could respond, the entire ship shook violently, and the floor seemed to dissolve beneath his feet. Screaming, he was swallowed by the void. When Elias regained consciousness, he was alone. Thebridge was silent, except for the constant laughter echoing faintly in the background. The others had vanished without a trace. Only he and the masked figure remained. It stood in the center of the room, its grotesque mask reflecting the dim light that lingered. Elias hesitated. Before asking who or what are you, the entity didn't respond immediately. Instead, it raised a gloved hand and pointed at Elias. Then for the first time it spoke. Its voice was a terrifying blend of thousands of other voices, all filled with hatred and contempt. I am the void. I am what remains when all else is gone, and you are next. The masked figure's voice echoed like a distorted thunderclap, each word slicing through my mind and emotions until I could barely think. His presence was oppressive, a physical force that seemed to crush me under the weight of his existence. I am the void. I am what remains when all else is gone. He wasn't just speaking. He was invading my consciousness, challenging the very notion of reality. What do you want? My question sounded weak, but he only tilted his head, studying. Slowly he began to walk toward me. His steps were silent, yet they vibrated in the air around me like invisible shockwaves. The grotesque mask gleamed in the dim light, feeding on the darkness. I want you, he replied, his voice now louder and more aggressive. You are part of me now. I backed away until I collided with the cold wall of the bridge. There was no escape. The ship seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as the constant laughter grew deafening. It was as if space itself were laughing at my helplessness. You can't have me, I responded, trying to sound firm, but my voice trembled. I'm human. I'm real. He stopped just a few meters away, tilting his head again. Then, he raised a gloved hand and pointed at my chest. Real? What is real? You have built your lives on lies, your stars are dust, your dreams are shadows, and now I will show you the truth. Before I could react, he slowly advanced, his hands reaching out as if to touch me. I closed my eyes, bracing for the worst, but felt something far more terrifying, an absolute sense of emptiness. It was as if something inside me was being sucked out, torn from my body and soul. My vision darkened, and for a moment, I thought I would pass out. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer on the bridge of the nightmare of void. I stood in an infinite space, surrounded by absolute darkness. There were no stars, no light, only the void. But this void wasn't static, it pulsed, breathed like a living entity. Indistinct shapes danced at the edges of my vision, impossible creatures twisting and merging into one another, defying all logic. And now you know, said the masked figure's voice echoing all around me. This is the true universe. This is the void. All of this is a lie? I asked, my voice barely audible. Everything I know, everything I believed. Not a lie, he replied. An illusion. A fragile dream you call reality, but the void is true. I looked around, trying to find something to anchor me to sanity. But there was nothing except the void and the monstrous shapes that seemed to watch me with invisible eyes. Why me? I asked, though I already knew any explanation would be insufficient. Because you saw me, he answered. You looked into the abyss, and the abyss looked back. Now you belong to it. The shapes around me began to spin rapidly, a whirlwind of colors and shadows. I felt my body being pulled in every direction at once, as if I were being torn apart at a molecular level. I screamed, but no sound came from my mouth. My entire body seemed to dissolve into the void. When I regained consciousness, I was back on the ship, or at least part of me was. Sitting on the floor of the bridge, I was flooded with fragments of memories that didn't seem to belong to me. Unknown planets, ancient civilizations, and impossible alien creatures. At the center of it all, always present, was the masked figure. What did you do to me? I asked, my voice faltering. I showed you the truth, he replied. Now you are part of the void. I rose slowly, trying to regain control. But something was different. I could feel it in the air, in the way the lights flickered in sync with my thoughts. I looked at my hands and saw them trembling. Not from fear, but from something deeper, as if I were connected to something far greater than myself. "Where are the others?" I asked, knowing I'd likely never see them again. "They have been absorbed," he answered indifferently. "Just as you will be." I shook my head, trying to resist. "No, I won't let you consume me." He laughed, a sound that echoed like 1,000 thunderclaps. "You have already been consumed, now laugh with me." Before I could react, the laughter began again. This time it wasn't just in my mind, it was everywhere. In the air, in the walls, in the very space around me. It was as if the entire universe were laughing at me, mocking my insignificance. Before the infinite void, and then something terrible happened. I started laughing too. At first it was involuntary, a nervous, almost hysterical laugh. But soon it transformed into something deeper, more insane. I couldn't stop. It was as if the laughter had become part of me, an extension of the void that had invaded my soul. I muttered between laughs. "This isn't possible." "Possible or not," he replied, his grotesque mask glowing faintly in the shadows. "You are mine now." The laughter continued, but it was no longer just the deafening echo reverberating through space. Now, it had become a part of me. Every time I tried to stop, my body trembled, and my lips curled involuntarily into a grotesque smile. It was as if the void had found a way to manifest itself through me, turning my humanity into a cruel joke. "Captain?" Clara's voice suddenly broke through, faint and distant like an echo from another world. I looked around, but she wasn't there. The bridge was completely empty, except for me and the masked figure, who now seemed to be everywhere, at once. "Clara," I called out, my voice trembling between uncontrollable bursts of laughter. "Where are you?" I'm here," she replied, her voice clearer now but still distorted, as if filtered through something alien. "But I'm not me anymore." Slowly she emerged from the shadows, or rather something that resembled Clara. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes glowed with an eerie light, like windows into the abyss. Her mouth stretched into a wide, deformed grin identical to the one on the masked man's face. She began to laugh too, a shrill, insane sound that blended with my own laughter. "You're not real," I muttered, backing up until my spine hit the wall again. "You can't be real." "Real?" she repeated, tilting her head to the side just as the masked figure had done earlier. "What is real, Elias? You said it yourself. Everything is an illusion. Even you." Before I could respond, other figures began emerging from the shadows. Marcus, Jace, Sarah, Victor, Lena. They were all there, but they weren't themselves anymore. Their bodies seemed made of something neither flesh nor metal, but something in between, defying logic. Their faces bore the same grotesque smiles, and each of them laughed, their sounds merging into a maddening cacophony that filled the air around me. "You're not real," I repeated, though deep down I knew I was lying to myself. "This isn't possible." "Possible or not," the masked figure's voice boomed like 1,000 thunderclaps. "Now you understand." I wanted to scream, cry, do anything, to escape this madness, but all I could do was laugh. My body no longer obeyed my commands. I was merely a spectator within my own mind, watching as the void consumed everything I was. "They are no longer them," the masked figure said, pointing at the crew. "They are extensions of the void, and soon so will you be." "No," I shouted, though the words came out as another hysterical burst of laughter. "I won't let this happen." "You already have," he replied, his voice dripping with scorn. "From the moment you saw me, you were doomed." I looked at the distorted remnants of my crew before me and realized he was right. They were no longer human. They were nothing. And I was following the same path. "Why?" I asked, my voice faltering. "Why are you doing this?" He tilted his head again as if pondering my question. Then slowly, he raised his gloved hand and pointed to the center of the room. Because the void has always been what exists between the stars, he answered. But now the void wants more. Before I could ask what he meant, the floor beneath my feet began to shake violently. The lights flickered, and then went out entirely, plunging the bridge into total darkness. Yet, I could still see the figures around me, their forms glowing with that same strange light emanating from their eyes. In the center of the room, something began to emerge. It was a rift in space, a black crack that seemed to suck in all light and sound around it. Indistinct shapes moved within it, creatures that shouldn't exist. Their silhouettes were impossible to describe, as if they defied the laws of physics and geometry. Slowly they began to emerge. "What are these things?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would be horrifying. "They are the void," he replied. "They are what remains when all else is gone." The creatures advanced toward us, their bodies twisting and shifting constantly. Some had multiple arms extending at impossible angles. Others seemed made of living shadows, their forms flowing like water. Each emitted a low, constant hum that vibrated directly into my soul. "Are they going to kill us?" I asked, though I knew. Death was too small a word to describe what was about to happen. "Death is too simple," he responded. "They will absorb you. They will make you part of them." Before I could react, the creatures attacked. They didn't use claws or teeth, but something far worse. Touch. When one reached me, I felt its hand, if it could even be called that, press against my chest. There was no pain, only an absolute cold, as if something was sucking out my essence, my soul. My vision began to darken again, but this time, it wasn't just the void around me. It was something inside me being torn away. My memories, my thoughts, my identity, all devoured by the creatures. "No," I murmured, though my voice was barely audible. "Please." But no one answered. Not Clara, not Marcus, not the masked figure. They simply watched as I was consumed by the void. When I regained consciousness, I was no longer on the ship. I was somewhere different, a place that defied all logical description. I floated in infinite space, surrounded by absolute darkness. There were no stars, no light, only the void. But this void wasn't static. It pulsed, breathed as if it were alive. Indistinct shapes danced at the edges of my vision, creatures that shouldn't exist. They writhed and merged with one another, creating patterns that made my mind spin. "And now you know." The masked figure's voice echoed around me. "This is the true universe. This is the void. All of this is a lie?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Everything I've known, everything I've believed." "It's not a lie," he replied. "It's an illusion, a fragile dream you call reality. But the void is true." Looked around, searching for some anchor to sanity, but there was nothing. Only the void and the monstrous shapes that seemed to watch me with invisible eyes. "Why me?" I asked, though I already knew any explanation would be insufficient. "Why did you come after me?" "Because you saw me," he answered. "You looked into the abyss, and the abyss looked back. Now you belong to it." Before I could respond, the shapes around me began moving faster, swirling into a vortex of colors and shadows. I felt my body being pulled in every direction at once, as if I were being torn apart at a molecular level. I screamed, but no sound escaped my lips. My entire body seemed to dissolve into the void. I lost all sense of time as I was torn apart by the void. Minutes, hours, centuries. Time no longer held meaning. All I felt was the sensation of being ripped away from myself, as if every fragment of my identity was being sucked into an endless abyss. My mind spun, desperately clinging to any shred of sanity that remained, but all I found were distorted memories and fragmented images. And then, finally, there was silence. When I regained consciousness, I was in a place that seemed familiar, yet utterly wrong. It was the bridge of the nightmare of void. But something was Off. The metallic walls were covered in thin cracks like black veins pulsating with an eerie light. The consoles flickered in random patterns as if alive. And in the center of the room, hovering like a malevolent shadow, was the masked figure. "You," I murmured, my voice faltering. "What have you done to me?" He tilted his head to the side as he always did, but this time there was something new in his demeanor. He seemed satisfied. "I have transformed you," he replied, his voice echoing like 1,000 thunderclaps. "You are no longer human." I looked at my hands and realized he was right. My skin, or what remained of it, glowed with that same strange light emanating from the cracks in the walls. My fingers appeared elongated, almost translucent as if made of glass. When I touched my face, I felt something hard and cold beneath my fingertips. A mask. I now wore a grotesque mask identical to his. "No," I muttered, though my own voice sounded distorted, as if filtered through something alien. "This can't be real." "Real?" he asked, laughing softly. "What is real now, Elias? You looked into the abyss, and the abyss looked back. Now you are part of it." I tried to scream, but all that came out was more laughter. Insane, contagious laughter that echoed through the ship like a demonic choir. It was as if the void had found a way to manifest itself through me, turning my very existence into a cruel joke. But then, something shifted. Something inside me seemed to awaken. Deep within my mind, a fragment of the man I once was still lingered. Oh, fragment that refused to vanish completely. "No," I murmured again, but this time there was strength in my voice. "I won't let this happen." The masked figure stopped laughing and stared at me, his head tilted in curiosity. "What can you do?" he asked, his voice dripping with scorn. "You have already been consumed." "Not completely," I replied, though I didn't know where this certainty came from. "There's still something here, something human." He laughed again, but this time his laughter seemed less confident. "Human? Don't you understand yet? Humanity is an illusion, a fragile dream that fades when the void arrives." "Then maybe it's time to wake up," I responded, though each word felt like it was tearing my throat apart. Before he could respond, something extraordinary happened. The cracks in the walls began to glow more intensely, emitting a pure white light that filled the entire room. The masked figure recoiled, his movements hesitant for the first time since I'd encountered him. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice now tinged with fear. "I don't know," I replied, though something deep inside me seemed to understand exactly what was happening. "But I think it's time to end this." The light continued to grow, spreading through the ship like a wave of pure energy. The distorted figures of my crew, Clara, Marcus, Jace, and the others, began to disappear, their forms dissolving into the light. The masked figure tried to resist, raising his hands as if to block the brilliance, but it was futile. He, too, began to fade, his grotesque mask melting like wax in the sun. "You cannot do this," he screamed, his voice echoing like a distorted thunderclap. "The void will always exist." "Maybe," I replied, though my own form was beginning to dissolve into the light. "But not everything has to be consumed by it." And then, with one final flash, everything disappeared. When I regained consciousness, again I was floating in space. There were no ships, no creatures, just me and the stars around me. My skin, or what remained of it, felt normal again, and the grotesque mask was gone. But something inside me had changed. I could still feel the void lurking in the corners of my mind, but it no longer controlled me. "Captain Carter," a familiar voice called. I turned and saw Clara floating beside me, her expression confused but alive. Behind her were Marcus, Jace, Sarah, Victor, and Lena. They all looked normal, as if nothing had happened. What happened?" I asked, my voice trembling. Clara shook her head. "We don't know. We were on the bridge, and then everything went white. When we woke up, we were here." I looked around, trying to make sense of it all. The nightmare. A void was intact, floating a few meters away. It seemed as though everything had returned to normal. But I knew it wasn't true. "He's gone," I murmured, unsure if I was speaking to them or to myself. For now. We returned to the ship in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. When we reached the bridge, everything seemed normal. The consoles worked perfectly, the lights were on, and there was no sign of the void or the masked figure. But then something caught my attention. In the corner of the room there was a mirror. A mirror I was certain hadn't been there before. I approached it slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. When I looked into the reflection, I saw something that froze me to the bone. In the mirror, I was still wearing the mask. "Elias," Clara called, her voice concerned. "Are you okay?" I forced a smile and turned to her. "Yes, I'm fine." But as I walked back to the console, I heard something, a faint, almost inaudible laugh echoing inside. My mind. "Laugh with me," it whispered. The laughter echoed inside my mind, a low, insidious sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was as if the void still lingered within me, hidden in the depths of my being, waiting for the perfect moment to resurface. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. It was woven into every thought, every breath, like a shadow I couldn't shake. "Captain?" Clara called again, her voice hesitant. "Are you sure you're okay?" I forced another smile, or at least something resembling one, and nodded. "I'm fine," I replied, though my words were little more than a hoarse whisper. "Just need a moment." But I knew there was no moment to be gained. The mask in the mirror proved that. It wasn't just an illusion or a distorted memory of what had happened. It was real. And it was inside me. I excused myself from the crew, claiming I needed to check the ship's systems. In truth, I just needed a moment alone to think, or at least try. But as soon as I stepped into the empty corridor, the laughter grew louder. It wasn't just in my mind anymore. It seemed to emanate from the walls, the floor, the very air I breathed. "Do you really think you could escape?" asked the masked man's voice, echoing like 1,000 thunderclaps. "You are part of me now." I spun around quickly, searching for the source of the voice, but there was no one there, just the empty corridor and the flickering lights above me. Then slowly I noticed something horrifying. The shadows on the walls were moving. They writhed and flowed like liquid, forming patterns that defied all logic. And in the center of those shadows was a face, a familiar face. It was him. The masked figure. "No," I murmured, backing up until my spine hit the cold wall. "You can't be here." "I am everywhere," he replied, his voice dripping with scorn. "Especially within you." Before I could react, the shadows surged forward, enveloping me like a black tide. I felt that same sensation of absolute cold, as if something was sucking out my essence, my soul. My vision darkened, and for a moment, I thought I would pass out. When I regained consciousness, I was back on the bridge, or at least part of me was. I was sitting on the floor, surrounded by fragments of memories that didn't belong to me. Images of unknown planets, ancient civilizations, and creatures beyond description flooded my mind. And at the center of it all, always present, was the masked figure. "You can't control me," I muttered, though my voice trembled. "I've beaten you before." "Beaten me?" he asked, laughing softly. "You still don't understand. I am part of you now. I always have been." I looked at my hands and realized he was right. My skin began to glow again with that strange light, and my fingers seemed elongated, almost translucent. When I touched my face, I felt the grotesque mask beneath my fingertips. "No," I murmured, though I knew resisting was futile. "This can't be happening." "It can," he replied, his voice booming like 1,000 storms. "Because the void will always exist." But then something shifted. That fragment of humanity within me, the small spark of sanity that had resisted before, awoke once more. This time, it brought something new with it. Rage. "Enough," I murmured, my voice firm despite the fear consuming me. I won't let you consume me again. He tilted his head, as if evaluating my declaration. And what can you do? He asked, his voice filled with mockery. You already belong to me. Not completely, I replied, though each word felt like it was tearing my throat apart. There's still something here. Something human. He laughed again, but this time his laughter seemed less confident. Human? You still don't get it. Humanity is an illusion, a fragile dream that fades when the void arrives. Then maybe it's time to wake up, I responded, though something deep inside me seemed to know exactly what was happening. But not alone. Before he could respond, something extraordinary happened. The lights on the bridge began to pulse again, emitting a pure white light that filled the entire room. The masked figure recoiled, his movements hesitant for the first time since I'd encountered him. What are you doing? He demanded, his voice now tinged with fear. I don't know, I replied, though every fiber of my being seemed to understand exactly what was happening. But I think it's time to end this. The light continued to grow, spreading through the ship like a wave of pure energy. The distorted figures of my crew, Clara, Marcus, Jace, and the others, began to disappear, their forms dissolving into the light. The masked figure tried to resist, raising his hands as if to block the brilliance, but it was futile. He, too, began to fade, his grotesque mask melting like wax in the sun. You can't do this, he screamed, his voice echoing like a distorted thunderclap. The void will always exist. Maybe, I replied, though my own form was beginning to dissolve into the light. But not everything has to be consumed by it. And then, with one final flash, everything disappeared. When I regained consciousness again, I was floating in space. There were no ships, no creatures, just me and the stars around me. My skin, or what remained of it, felt normal again, and the grotesque mask was gone. But something inside me had changed. I could still feel the void lurking in the corners of my mind, but it no longer controlled me. Captain Carter? A familiar voice called. I turned and saw Clara floating beside me, her expression confused but alive. Behind her were Marcus, Jace, Sarah, Victor, and Lena. They all looked normal, as if nothing had happened. What happened? I asked, my voice trembling. Clara shook her head. We don't know. We were on the bridge, and then everything went white. When we woke up, we were here. I looked around, trying to make sense of it all. The nightmare of void was intact, floating a few meters away. It seemed as though everything had returned to normal. But I knew it wasn't true. He's gone, I murmured, unsure if I was speaking to them or to myself. For now. We returned to the ship in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. When we reached the bridge, everything seemed normal. The consoles worked perfectly, the lights were on, and there was no sign of the void or the masked figure. But then something caught my attention. In the corner of the room, there was a mirror. A mirror I was certain hadn't been there before. I approached it slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. When I looked into the reflection, I saw something that froze me to the bone. In the mirror, I was still wearing the mask. Elias? Clara called, her voice concerned. Are you okay? I forced a smile and turned to her. Yes, I'm fine. But as I walked back to the console, I heard something, a faint, almost inaudible laugh echoing inside my mind. Laugh with me, it whispered, and then slowly I began to laugh.